Hi, everybody. I'm Cameron Anderson at the Haas School, and I'm a professor in the Management of Organizations group. And I've been teaching a class called Power and Politics for about the last 20 years or so. And what I wanted to discuss in this short video is how to influence people, specifically in the context that we're in right now. And that is that, during this shutdown where we're all working virtually, or many of us are, we are primarily communicating with other people through virtual channels, through email, through phone, through video chat. And unfortunately, what this means is it becomes more difficult for us to influence others. And so what I want to cover is really a couple things. One is I want to cover why is it that virtual communication makes it more difficult to influence people? And second is, what can you do to overcome those challenges? Given the obstacles in front of you, what are some extra steps that you can take to ensure that your influence stays where it was? But before I get into it, let me take a quick step back and lay a bit of, conceptual framework. So one of the major themes that I have in my class is that a leader's job is kind of twofold. On the one hand, leaders, of course, need to make the right decisions. They need to come up with good ideas. They need to leverage their team's wisdom and set the right course for their organization or their group. That obviously is very challenging, and many of our classes here at Haas cover that. They give you the analytical skills you need to make those good decisions or to be innovative. But leadership is really about two things. One is making the right decisions or coming up with good ideas. And then the second part of it is executing and implementing on what those decisions are, right? It's just not enough to have a good idea. You also need to be able to influence other people to buy into that idea and then to absolutely kind of implement that idea in a way that's efficient and effective. So influence, as it turns out, is an absolutely critical component to leadership success. And that's still the case under the current circumstances. So with this shutdown that we're all experiencing right now, we still need to be influential. We still need other people to buy into our ideas, but influence becomes more difficult. Now, why is that? Well, I'll talk about three different obstacles that are introduced in virtual communication. First is trust. And trust is a funny one to start with because for many people, they don't necessarily link the ability to influence other people with trust. Trust seems totally separate. But here's why it's critical. Trust means that people understand that you're on their side, that you've got their best interests at heart. They know that you're not going to exploit them in some way, that you're not going to manipulate them in some way, and that whatever ideas that you're pushing forward are going to benefit them as well as you. If people trust you, they're going to be much more open-minded. They're going to be much more open-eared, right? They're going to be willing to listen to you and willing to be influenced by you. Whereas if they don't trust you and they are not totally sure that you're on their side, maybe you don't care about their own interests or their own well-being, they're going to be much more guarded. Your idea, as good as it is going to be met with suspicion and mistrust. And so anything you say is going to be less effective. It's going to resonate less with them because they're always wondering whether you're telling them the full truth or not. So building trust is absolutely critical to influence. Now, the difficulty here is that building trust is difficult enough. It's challenging enough when you are working with people face-to-face all the time. It's even more difficult virtually because, very simply, whenever you're talking with people virtually, whether it's over the phone or through video chat, the physical distance that separates you gets translated in what you might call psychological distance, meaning people just don't feel as connected, as cohesive. And so there's an abundance of research on this topic, but it very consistently shows that people expect lower levels of cooperation. They expect higher levels of deceit whenever they're dealing with people virtually. And that is justified in some ways. There is higher levels of deceit and manipulation in virtual communication. And there is lower level of cooperation in virtual communication. So on top of that, not to be totally doom and gloom here, but this specific moment in history also makes trust more difficult because people are feeling highly anxious, right? They're not only anxious about their own careers and what this whole crisis might do to them, but they're anxious about friends or loved ones and whether people that they know might get sick. They're anxious about how this might affect the economy, how it might affect the world. There's a lot of anxieties here. And the scientific research on anxiety is also clear in saying that whenever people are feeling anxious and nervous and worried, they're that much more guarded. They're that much more reluctant to trust anybody and make themselves vulnerable in some way. So in some respects, you kind of are in a trust hole during this COVID crisis when you're dealing with people only virtually. The second obstacle on top of trust is that whenever you're dealing with people virtually, it's much more difficult to communicate clearly. This is maybe intuitive to you. We all have a sense as though, communicating via email is difficult because we don't have the vocal tone and we don't have the body language. You don't get the full picture of what people are trying to tell you and vice versa in an email. And so miscommunication is more likely. Even conflict is more likely, which is true when you're dealing with people virtually. Well, communicating clearly is an interesting topic, though, because people know that this is true. They know it's more difficult virtually, but they still don't understand how difficult it is. There's a lot of research coming out of Cornell University, for example, where they find that, if you send an email to someone, and let's say I, as a researcher, would ask you, what are the chances that your message it was received loud and clear, that the person who received it totally understood what you were talking about? On average, people say, let's say there's about an 85 to 90% chance that their team member fully understood what they were talking about in that email. But in reality, when these researchers go back and look at the rates by which people do fully understand it, it's about 50 to 60%, which is a huge drop, right? So people still, even though we do have this intuition that virtual communication is difficult, we still overestimate how clear we're being in those channels. We still underestimate the difficulties involved. So trust, clear communication, and then the third one is just straight up influence. Above and beyond these other two factors, trust and communication clarity, it just becomes more difficult to get other people to say yes because you're not face to face with them. And again, you can kind of understand this thinking from their perspective, right? If somebody asks you something, if they ask for a favor or they ask you to sit down and listen to an idea that they want to pitch, you're much more likely to say yes if you're face to face with them. It's difficult to say no. It's uncomfortable to say no when you're face to face with someone. It's much easier, however, to say no via email or even through the phone. There's this natural human tendency where it's just that much more easy and less uncomfortable to just type out an answer and a reason why you can't do what they're asking you to do. And so influence itself, above and beyond these other factors, just becomes that much more difficult. So those are the three main obstacles, right? Trust, clear communication, influence itself. As I said, I also want to talk about how you can overcome these obstacles. Like, what are some techniques or some strategies that you can use so that you're just as influential, maybe even more so, when you're dealing with people virtually? Well, let's start with trust. So again, remember this idea that trust at its core is that people know you're on their side. They know that you care about their well-being and their welfare. One obvious implication of this idea is that you want to convey to them as clearly as you can that you do care about them, that you want what's best for them. And in turn, one way to do that is to ask how they're doing. Just ask how this whole crisis has affected them, how they're feeling, what you can do to reassure them in some way or help them in their work. Those kinds of conversations go a long way in conveying to your team that you're not just in it for yourself and your own ambition and career, you also really do care about them. One of the things that's really interesting about this crisis is that I'm still in contact with a lot of different leaders and managers, whether they're alums or people have taken my class, or even just friends in my social network who have started their own company. And I've talked to a number of them who the first meeting that they had virtually, typically over Zoom, in the first meeting they had after this crisis hit, a number of them decided to put aside what they had planned to talk about, their specific kind of task-oriented agendas. And instead what they did was they just opened up this discussion about how people are feeling, about how each person believes that this crisis might affect them and what kind of worries and concerns they have. And then they talked about ways to address those concerns. And for those managers, for those leaders who did that, who took that meeting just to kind of check in with people and make sure they were okay, to a person, every single one of them says that their team absolutely appreciated it and loved it. That if anything, it kind of strengthened the bond with their team. Now, beyond that first initial meeting, another thing you can do is to communicate more often with people than you normally would, right? So if the frequency with which you tend to communicate with a particular team member is, let's say, once a week, ironically, during the shutdown, even though we're not physically close to each other anymore, you might want to check in with them even more often than you normally do. And why is that? Well, again, kind of think of it from their perspective. If you check in with them frequently, coming from their perspective, you're that much more reassured that your leader, your manager is still there for you. Whereas if you go long periods of time without talking to each other or checking in, the kind of anxieties that are naturally there to begin with are going to build. They're going to wonder what's happening. Why haven't I heard from them in quite some time? And so on top of that sort of check-in and welfare check, you also want to just check in more frequently. The third piece in terms of trust is a little meatier, and this involves being as transparent as you can in your decision making. And what I mean by transparent is whenever you make decisions that affect your team, and virtually that's all decisions that you make, you want to explain the rationale behind that decision. Sometimes it's not feasible. Sometimes you can't open up the hood and let them see the inner workings of your decision making. But whenever it is feasible, it's always a good idea to explain to them why you made that decision. I'll use a silly example. Let's say your team is working on a very large project, and so you're divvying up different roles and responsibilities to different team members. Inevitably, somebody's going to get a role or responsibility that they didn't want. In other words, they're going to be unhappy with whatever you assign to them. In a situation like that, if you're able to be transparent, if you're able to explain to them why you assign them that portion of it, they'll feel way better. So for example, maybe it was their turn, or maybe their area of expertise aligned perfectly with that specific assignment you gave them. Whatever the reason, tell them this so that even though they didn't get what they wanted, they fully grasp that the process by which you made this decision was fair. There's a whole scientific literature, much of it starting right here at Cal actually, on what's called procedural justice. And time again, it has found that even if people don't get what they want in terms of outcomes, they feel okay as long as the process that was deciding those outcomes was fair. Now, the last piece in terms of maintaining trust is to use what you might call participative decision making. There's a lot of different names for this process, but participative decision making means more democratic forms of leadership, involving your team as much as you can in the decisions that you're making. So if a problem comes up and you're trying to figure out how to solve it, it means laying the problem out on the table and asking your team for their input and their ideas. And then when you're doing that, after you've solicited their advice and their opinions, you actively listen. You truly take it in. You repeat back to them what you think you understand that they're saying. In the end, you kind of synthesize and integrate all of their different perspectives and ideas. Because if you do so, there's a couple things that's going to happen. One is the science is very clear. Your decisions are going to be better. You're going to be more innovative. But getting back to this idea of trust, your team is also going to trust you more because they don't have to guess how certain decisions are being made. They've been part of those decisions. They've seen it firsthand. So it's sort of hyper transparency, you might call. Okay, so that's trust. The second obstacle that I mentioned is clear communication. And In many ways, clear communication is very simply addressed through more time and effort. As simple as this sounds, the more time and effort you put into clear communication, the clearer it's going to be. So remember I said before that people vastly overestimate how clear they're being. Well, keep that in mind whenever you're writing an email or whenever you're preparing for a particular Zoom conference call. Putting in more time means just going over it maybe once, twice, 3 times sometimes, and revising it or preparing what you're going to say before the presentation, going over your notes a few times, again, to make sure that what you're saying seems very clear. You know, if you want to put a specific number on it, put twice the amount of time that you normally would into preparation for a meeting or in writing an email, because it's going to go a long way, again, in making sure your ideas get across. Second is, this idea of summary emails is always a good one, but it's particularly important now. So after a particular conference call or Zoom meeting, you know, just send a quick email afterwards summarizing what you believe to be the decisions that you've made, right? So in bullet point form, you can say, here are the main points that I took away from this. Am I getting anything wrong, right? Let me know if I mischaracterized part of our conversation. That is something that I've always believed is a good idea, but now it's that much more important because, of course, it'll ensure that they understood you correctly, but it'll also make sure that you understood them. And then the third piece to clear communication here is to what you might call polish your communication style as much as you can. So what this means is your communication style, of course, involves a lot of different components to it. It involves the words that you use. It involves your vocal tone, the way you say things. And it also involves your body language, your postures or your gestures or your eye contact. And all of those pieces are really important to communicating clearly. Polishing your style of communication means first getting objective evidence of what your style is like, right? Rather than relying on your own intuition as to how you're coming across to others, seek out objective data on how you're coming across to others. So as painful as it is, watch yourself on video, right? If it's possible for you to record a Zoom call, for example, and then to watch that recording afterwards, that's a really effective way to see how you're coming across. Another effective way is to ask trusted colleagues or maybe even your team. You know, if you are trying to convey something, ask them whether you're doing so effectively. Ask whether there are certain blind spots that you're missing, right? Maybe you're trying to convey a very open-minded approach to these meetings, but you're not quite doing it. By getting that objective feedback, of course, that's going to allow you to pinpoint the specific areas of improvement that you should focus on. Now, those were ways to overcome the difficulties in clear communication. The third challenge, as I mentioned before, is just straight up influence, that it's that much more difficult to influence people in more impoverished forms of communication. Well, so how can you overcome this challenge? Well, even in this current shutdown, there's a number of different ways in which you can communicate with people. The richest form, of course, is video chat, right? So Zoom calls, when you can see each other and hear each other at the same time, that's going to be the best. Then you have phone calls, because at least you can hear the tone of voice that people have while they're talking to you. Then email, then text, or something that's even cruder and that doesn't allow for that much communication at all. As much as you can, use the richest form of communication available. Because again, that's going to allow you to be more effective in influencing others. As painful as Zoom meetings are for some people, and as much as some people don't want to use them because they're just kind of comfortable, let's say over the phone, or they don't want to get dressed up for a Zoom call, if you need to influence people, Zoom is the best way to go, or Skype, or whatever other video chat you're using. The second is, whatever the form is that you're using, and let's say it's over the phone, you want to, quote unquote, double down on many of the tactics that are available to you in that form. So, for example, in a phone call, of course, people still can hear the words that you're saying. They can still hear your vocal tone. And so you want to use the tactics and techniques in the verbal and paraverbal channel as much as you can, even more than you would if you were face-to-face. So let me be more concrete. One of the things that I advocate for whenever you're trying to persuade someone is to use quote unquote hard arguments as much as you can, right? To back up your arguments with numbers, with data, facts, figures, statistics, both because it's going to back up your argument, but also because it's going to build your own credibility as a speaker. Well, whenever you're dealing with people virtually, you can still use that technique. And I would say you want to use it even more, right? So work that much harder on crafting those pieces of evidence or those arguments in your favor that are harder in nature. Even in terms of the paraverbal channel, right? Paraverbally, the more relaxed and at ease we feel, oddly enough, it doesn't just send this signal that we're relaxed. It also sends the signal that we're in command of this domain, that we feel comfortable, that we feel like we have expertise in it. And so if you do talk to people in a very natural way where you're very relaxed, paraverbally, that is also going to build your influence because it sends the signal that I know what I'm saying. So to wrap up really quickly, again, what I wanted to cover are a couple things. One is, what are the major obstacles to influence in virtual communication? And so we talked about trust, we talked about clear communication, and then we talked about influence per se. The second part was, how do you overcome the obstacles that are presented in virtual communication? And so with trust, we talked about conveying clearly to your team that you are on their side, checking in with them more frequently than you might normally. For clear communication, it's about, as much as you can, work harder on your emails, put in more time to make sure they're clear, work harder at preparing for meetings so that whatever you're going to say is that much clearer. And for influence, it's about using the richest form of communication possible. And then if you are in a less rich form, if you are, let's say, dealing with people over the phone or over email, it's working that much harder in using the tactics and techniques that tend to work in the verbal channel, right? So hard arguments, fluency in speech, using a relaxed vocal tone, all of those things that they can pick up on. So that's it for me. I really hope that you are all staying safe and healthy during the shutdown and you're doing okay. It goes without saying that you can contact me at any time if you want any more information about any of these topics. There's a number of really well-written books that cover them. And so I'll hope to speak to you soon. And again, I hope that you are doing well under the circumstances.